My name's Neil Burridge. Welcome to my sword corner. Over the last 20 years I've made a lot of these, I've seen a lot of swords in museums and I've learned a lot, and I'd like to share it with you. The last film I made was ages ago, and it's taken a long time for ideas and connections to fall into place. I'm not naturally familiar with camera technology and video, so it's gradually fallen into place, and now we're back on the screen. I'm not going to make films about bronze casting, because there's hundreds of films about bronze casting on YouTube. But what I'm going to try and do is show you some interesting things about swords, and because that's one thing that is kind of missing, the small details about Bronze Age swords, the interesting parts. Everybody focuses on making the castings and the excitement about it, but all the fine minutiae of detail that make a sword really interesting is more the place that I follow through rather than sort of casting. I never actually call myself a bronze caster. I say I'm a bronze sword smith, because the way I work. When I started 20 years ago, my hobby just drove me forward, and I was just interested in generally in Bronze Age, and then I started to get more and more interested in the metalworking. But and gradually, as you learn, your ability to cast things increases, and a druid asked me for a sword, and I'd never made a sword before, and I thought, how interesting, I'll give that a go. New challenge. I managed to make quite a reasonable sword, nothing compared to with today, but I suddenly realised swords had a special kind of magic attached to them, and ever since that day and making that sword for a druid, I've kind of been more focused on swords themselves. And over the last, I'd say, nearly 20 years, I've been very lucky that I've met some of the brightest minds in archaeology working on swords. I've seen a lot of swords. I've probably seen somewhere near 300, 400 swords in different museums. I've been so lucky with curators opening their collections to me, showing me stuff, and even today I've still got quite strong ties to curators that curate Bronze Age collections. So if anything interesting comes in, somewhere I'll get to see it, and it's worked as a nice sort of interaction. They get to hear somebody who makes it talking about it, and it paints a bigger picture in what they're looking at and curating. I've probably cast nearly 500 sword blades, and I say that because I cast them one at a time. Each one is a single casting. I cast it, and some were finished, some were for courses, but it's not like I produce 30 moulds and then melt 30 kilos of bronze and pour into every mould in a long line of casting. I tend to cast each sword one at a time. Maybe I'll do a run of 3, and it might take me 30 minutes for every sword, but I do them one at a time, and it's different. So I'm not a mass producer. Bronze casting today is incredibly can be very sophisticated or very simple, and to manufacture stuff you can make a model, you can mold it, make it in wax, and then you can cast tens or hundreds or even thousands. But it's not me, because it doesn't feel like the kind of Bronze Age I want to interact. So for a craftsman like me, it was competing with people with much bigger foundry systems, and they still don't, or most of them still don't produce anything that resembles a Bronze Age sword in my mind, because I'm looking for those small details and the technical understanding of things they did. And even after 20 years of working with bronze, making stuff and constantly improving, I still think I probably score about a 5 on a Bronze Age scale of 10. And some people would say my swords are the best, but when you look at the Bronze Age stuff, sometimes even I think, oh crumbs, how did they cast that? How could they make something so beautiful with so simple equipment? So it's never a level playing field, even though we're 3,000 years later. In the last film, must be about 6 or 7 years ago, I think now, so a lot's happened since then. I made a film and I sent it out to America for a gentleman called Sgeir to test on a tree, and test he did. He beat the sword against a silver birch tree endlessly, and then he did another couple of tests, and it completely opened a window for me. I got a chance to see something about my swords I'd never seen, and it kind of enlightened me in a way about swords, because I tried quite a lot to make the sword stiff before I sent it off, to make it rigid so it wouldn't bend, but the oblique blows were really cruel to the blade, so I'd never even seen this before. So I learned quite a lot from that. Things have moved on a lot since then. I've learned a lot more tricks. And later on I had interactions with Thrand and his channel, and he took my swords again and he took them into quite extreme conditions, with his ballistic gel head with the coconut and the plastic jawbone. And I was quite amazed how much stress and brutality really the swords would have suffered, because I never sword fighting's not my thing, so it's no pointlessly for me to go out there and start bashing swords on things, because I don't know what I'm doing. So, and I suddenly realized there's kind of a timeless interaction between the swordsmith and the swordsman. The way they interacted 3,000 years ago would have changed the way the sword was made or improved, and this must have happened thousands and thousands of times, but it's all kind of lost in the past. Thrand was very enlightened, and there was one part in the film, in the first film they used it, the swords were bending slightly and they were giving them a right good beating, and then he said, we've changed the way we've used the swords and now they're cutting much better. And I thought, wow, I've never seen anybody do that before. Changed his use style, because remember, everybody's used to modern steel swords, and bronze swords are not really a fair comparison. So for him to change the way he approached the use made it quite profound for me, and I thought, yes, and it opened more and more doors for me to understand. I was also surprised how well they cut. That was quite a shock, to be honest, because I'd been doing the edges and I'd been pushing the edges as far as I could, but until somebody actually did some cutting, you never really know if you're going in the right way. And the test cuts with the rolled newspaper, there's one where he cuts through and the newspaper's half dry, so he's cut through several tightly rolled newspapers, and the cut's very clean and it's gone all the way through, and I thought, wow, that is quite something. So it shows that study pays off, that if you study the objects, and remember, I've seen a lot of swords, and occasionally you see a sword that has some really interesting points about it. Again, this is where I'm very grateful to all the curators that have said, oh, do you want to see my collection? I'll get something out for you. It pays dividends. So it's something that everybody contributes to. It's not just me making this, doing that. It's that everybody puts into something. At the end result, it basically means I get to make better swords because I'm learning more about things. Some of you who follow me on Facebook will know that I kind of do a lot of Scottish swords. And the reason is that I've been quite lucky to have some interesting interactions with curator in Scotland, and the Canusti sword excavation, the results from it have been fairly profound stuff, and I'm going to look at a sword and talk about it. So it's the sword from Canusti really was quite interesting. It opened a lot of things for me. One was the pommel, and that's from really the Canusti pommel was why I'm now doing more pommels in metal. And the other one was the pin that was found with it, a sunflower pin, which I haven't got here. Was also another thing that opened up a kind of window on the swords. And the last one was the gold decoration on the spear, which was quite interesting. So we're going to talk through a sword. And also, remember, the last film was 7 years ago. I managed to learn how to cast a better sword since then. So we're going to look at this sword and talk about it and how I've improved and things. So this is the Canusti sword originally had a horn handle shell, but it's got this handle imprint, which I kind of like. There's something about it I'm finding quite pleasant. Aesthetically, it's quite pleasing. It's got less rivets, 2 rivets there and 2 there, and the metal pommel. The blade I'm casting now, when I was doing the last sword, I was sand casting, but I've got stone mould for this sword now, and I actually get much nicer castings out of a stone mould than I do out of sand. Sand's pretty good, and it has some advantages over stone, but the end product for me is much crisper. I like the crispness. I'm not a lost wax caster, so you can cast some swords by lost wax and the results are really good, but it's more and more industrial, and it's further and further away from Bronze Age, and it loses the interest for me. I'm not out to make lots of swords. I want to make Bronze Age swords. So, but it's a new technology, and it's taken me a long time to learn it. With all these things, it just doesn't, it's not like chocolate casting where you pour your chocolate in and the chocolate comes out of the rubber mould and you pour more chocolate in. It's not like that with swords. I do have miscasts, and when I'm learning, you have even more miscasts. So the bronze pommels are fascinating. You get them in several swords in Scotland. I'm not going to focus on one particular sword at the moment, apart from the Canusti sword. But the Canusti sword, when it's excavated, I'm going to take this off. I'm going to move it out of the way so you can see this better. The sword is found, but right next to the hilt was a pile of tin alloy corrosion. So the pommel had disappeared, and it was also a long way from the sword. So they were querying whether it was a pommel. But I noticed something interesting when I made it, was something now jokingly called the Subbuteo effect, which is when you're a young lad in sort of my age, when I was about sort of 15, there used to be a football game called Subbuteo. It was a round wobbly bottom, weighted thing with a football figure on, and you used to knock them around the thing, and they used to always return to the same upright position. And I think what probably happened with the Canusti sword was the pommel parted from the sword and rolled away backwards. in the Subbuteo effect, when the sword was buried, it was buried with a spear and a pin, wrapped in furs and buried in the ground. And the handle decayed, the tang of it being antler or bone, and the pommel rolled away and stood like this. And that's why the pommel was not attached to the sword. And when I showed them, they were amazed, and they said, that's obvious, isn't it? But until you make the pommel and put it down and let it roll, it could have easily have stayed there if the soil packing around it had held. But for some reason it had rolled away from the sword, and it all made sense. That's quite interesting. So I made a tin pommel, and it's quite interesting. A lot of sword people that I talk to like the weight more in the back. So adding the metal pommel would have added more balance to the sword further back. And it made me realise there are some Wilburton swords that have been found with like a lead ring, the sort of section of small finger, but they were integral in some kind of pommel, but the pommel has long gone, and it wasn't a round pommel because the lead objects are not particularly neatly cast. It's almost like somebody scraped a hole and filled them with lead to increase the weight. So that was another parallel that occurred to me. So I thought that was quite interesting. Anyway, I've got really into it. So there's several swords in Scotland. It seems that the Ewart Park type sword is much more developed in Scotland in some ways. And you get solid cast handles. I'm going to bring one over like this. And you don't get this type of sword in southern Britain. These are very Scottish. They've taken the idea, they've developed it. Again, the pommel, quite often they're like half a tennis ball, but other pommels have the more oval shape, which means they sit in the wrist better. And when Thrand was doing some tests and he noticed that I changed the pommel shape from round to oval, it made a lot of difference to how he used the sword, and that was quite interesting. So interacting with people, exchanging ideas is a timeless thing, and it would have happened in the Bronze Age. So even with this type of solid handled sword, they come in two varieties. One is they're integral to the blade. They're all one casting. They're still hollow, but it's all one casting. Or the other one is that the handle is added afterwards, like a repair. If the handle's broken, they cast a hollow bronze handle onto a good blade. They think, oh, I like that sword, I'm going to keep it, and I want a bronze handle on it. So that's another way of doing it, is to cast it over. So it shows they're able to cast on to it. I'm not sure about European swords because I haven't had a chance to look at them closely, and that's why I tend to talk about what I've seen rather than look at pictures in books and say. But I've noticed some x-rays that a lot of the European Urnfield swords, the handles are attached, they're cast and then attached on. There's even a couple of bronze like lollipop molds for casting handles, and you pull the core out after you've poured the bronze. Once it's set enough, you can release the handle. And there's a friend in Netherlands tried it, and he found it very hard to get the hollow part to pull out of the mould and leave the casting behind. He found it very frustrating. But I'm sure if he went back to the Bronze Age, they would teach him. So the pommel thing is quite nice. Again, on this handle, I'm showing the other more common choice of outline on the handle here, where it's at the top of ricasso going across. Most of the swords down south seem to follow this, and sometimes the Omega here is smaller and rounder. Quite often you have two rivets here, 1, 2, 3 in the southern swords, or 2, same again. But another thing I wanted to talk about is the blade forms. So this is just basically a quickly cleaned up casting, and the edges are forged on it. What I want to say is that if you took all the Wilburton swords and all the Ewart Park swords in this country and you cut them off here, and you put a big pile of handles there and a big pile of blades there, it would be very hard to say that's a Ewart Park, that's a Wilburton. Once you remove the handles, the identity of the sword becomes very, what's the word, it's more uniform. The blades are very similar. The level of point or tapering on the end to point varies a bit, but it varies a bit in Wilburtons and Ewart Parks, just in their own grouping. So the leaf bladed form, it really covers both swords, and it stems from earlier Ballantober swords and swords much earlier than that. So the whole leaf bladed thing develops in this country. In Europe, there's a lot more parallel to tapering edge swords in a different way. So there's obviously something about the swords here that makes people stay with them. I don't monetize my films. The idea is to share my knowledge with you. So if you want to support me, you can buy me a cup of coffee in the link below, and if you could like, share and hit the subscribe button, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.